This module deals with progressivism and how it has shaped California politics and policy. As with so many other things, progressivism was a response to events that were occurring throughout the country, but its roots and its impact was especially strongly felt in California. So let's take a look at what we mean by progressivism. I want to spend just a little bit of time clarifying our terms. The word progressive has many different connotations in modern day usage. It means different things in different contexts. Perhaps the most common everyday use of that word in modern politics is as a synonym for liberal. People often use the terms progressive and liberal interchangeably to connote an approach to politics that includes things like a more active role for government in addressing widespread economic or social problems, and less government intervention in legislating or upholding traditional moral values. In other words, the opposite of a conservative, who is more likely to advocate for a limited government role in the economy, but a more active role for government in supporting traditional values. This modern use of the word progressive certainly has deep connections to the way I'm going to use the term. I want to be a bit more precise about how we're talking about California progressivism in this module. In particular, we'll be looking at the progressive movement and the ways in which it has left indelible marks on our politics. The progressive movement was an organized effort that peaked from the 1890s to the 1920s that was concerned with substantially reshaping American politics. The authors of your reading state, progressivism sought to replace fundamental American political practices, such as a limited government of separated powers, with an unlimited government closer to the parliamentary model. Now, I happen to think that the authors overstate the case just a little bit here, but their basic idea is right. Progressives looked around at what was occurring at that time and decided the old way of looking at politics no longer worked for the American people. So they developed new ideas and proposals about the basic purposes of government and how it should operate. So this is a big, messy subject, but in the next few slides, I'll try to summarize the major planks or elements of progressivism in the late 1800s and early 1900s. A first major goal of the progressive movement was what they called the rationalization of government. Progressives at this time looked around and saw government as a corrupt, irrational mess. Government agencies were understaffed and ineffective. Government jobs were based on a patronage or spoils system in which the party that won the previous election handed out government jobs as a reward to party loyalists. This was a good way of getting people active in party politics, but was a recipe for corruption and incompetence in government service. Pictured on this slide, we see a political cartoon skewering President Andrew Jackson, the president most closely associated with introducing the spoils system at the federal level. Jackson rose to the presidency on his reputation as a war hero, and the cartoon plays on that by depicting him in uniform, but rather than riding a horse, he's mounted on a pig feeding at a trough, a metaphor for the corruption that ran rampant in government at this time. So this is what the progressives were fighting against. Their alternative was to create a professional bureaucracy, that the people who work in government departments carrying out laws and government programs should serve based on professional qualifications to perform specific job functions, rather than based on political connections. This is an area in which progressives succeeded in reshaping government. However, they also believed it was possible to apply scientific principles to government programs to achieve a concrete public interest. In other words, progressives thought there was a neutral, non-political way of determining the best policy. This is an idea that's largely fallen out of favor, because almost any major government policy requires trade-offs between different goals, and there's rarely a fully impartial way to say what the trade-off should be. Different people place different value on different things, and teasing out those differences, that's kind of the messy core of politics. You can't just rely on an expert to come up with the perfect non-political solution. Finally, progressives sought to limit the power of political parties. They saw parties as corrupt institutions run by bosses who used the spoils system to maintain their grip on power through rewards and punishments. So progressive reformers advocated for direct primaries for high elected offices. This meant that voters, rather than party insiders, would choose the party's nominees to run in the general election. Additionally, the progressive movement advocated for local and judicial elections to be conducted on a non-partisan basis, in which candidates do not run under a party label, and parties are not allowed to endorse candidates. The progressives were largely successful in these efforts, as their reforms stripped party insiders of their power. While the two-party system remains alive and well, the organizational structure and power of political parties in the United States is a fraction of what it was during the heyday of political party politics back in the late 1800s. Related to rationalizing government operations, the progressive movement sought to reduce corruption. It's during this time that we see the first serious attempt to regulate campaigns. For instance, by requiring candidates to disclose where their campaign funds came from and how they are spent. The California Secretary of State's office maintains a helpful webpage of the history of the political reform division, detailing the various efforts over time to try to ensure clean elections and transparency in government. So I've asked you to read that page because it pretty nicely shows the continuation of political reform efforts in California, beginning with the progressive movement, but continuing right through to the current day. Another major anti-corruption effort of the progressive movement was to prosecute crooked government and corporate officials for bribery and other forms of corruption. In 1906, for instance, these efforts led to the indictment of 17 local politicians in San Francisco who were in the pocket of the Southern Pacific Railroad, the overwhelmingly dominant corporate power in California at that time. Southern Pacific was referred to as the octopus because its tentacles reached into every area of the state's economy. So pictured in this slide is a political cartoon of the octopus, showing the Southern Pacific Corporation choking off different sectors of economic and political life in California. And if you can look carefully, in the octopus's eyes are two of the so-called Big Four corporate titans who led Southern Pacific, including Leland Stanford. With progressives attacking what they saw as a corrupt political establishment that was beholden to powerful corporate interests, they thought the solution was to give greater political power to the citizenry. They accomplished this through constitutional amendments in 1911 that gave California voters access to the direct democracy tools of the initiative, referendum, and recall. Women's suffrage, or the right to vote, was also achieved in California in 1911, nearly a decade before it was enacted nationwide. This action essentially doubled the share of the population that now had a direct voice in the political process. With these new tools of direct democracy, progressives argued it was critical to have an informed electorate, so they supported a variety of investments in public education, including the establishment of kindergarten, providing textbooks free of charge in public schools, and funding the University of California system. Progressives believed that given a strong educational background, citizens would naturally want to become engaged in politics and have a direct say in managing the affairs of the state. So the cartoon on this slide kind of wonderfully depicts the ideal that progressives had in mind, with the honest voter standing tall and using the initiative and referendum to whip the corrupt interests from the Capitol. Another major element of the progressive movement was economic reform. The rapid industrialization of the U.S. economy following the Civil War had utterly transformed the country, giving it newfound wealth, but also producing levels of corporate power and economic inequality far beyond what had existed in the earlier days of an agrarian economy. In particular, progressives attacked the monopoly power that a handful of corporations had accumulated, dominating the marketplace and stifling competition. California in particular felt the force of monopoly power of the Southern Pacific Railroad, which dominated the state's transportation network and had absolute power to set rates on the shipment of goods in the state. So if you were a business owner who relied upon shipping your goods to reach markets for sale, you were at the complete mercy of Southern Pacific. So a major proposal of progressives was antitrust legislation, which involves breaking up monopolies to ensure competition in the marketplace. Depicted in this slide is a political cartoon of President Theodore Roosevelt, a major figure in the progressive movement at the national level, shown as a sort of progressive crusader, swinging his antitrust club to knock out various monopolies, including oil and railroads. Now, the cartoonist kind of pokes a little bit of fun at Roosevelt here, suggesting that he's gone too far, by also indicating that he's knocked out everything in general. In addition to antitrust legislation, the progressive movement advocated for a wide variety of labor laws, including such things as minimum wage, the 40-hour work week, workers' compensation, union protections, and child labor laws. Progressives also sought to reduce the economic inequality resulting from the industrial era by instituting a tax system that more heavily taxed corporate profits and required the rich to pay a higher share of their income in taxes than the middle class and the poor. These tax ideas that came from the progressive movement have become so firmly embedded in our tax code today that we still call them progressive taxes. Finally, the progressive movement advocated for a much more active role for government in addressing social problems, particularly those that had arisen as a result of rapid industrialization and urbanization. As mentioned earlier, progressives placed great emphasis on public education. They also advocated for greater government investments in public health and safety, so things like sanitation, for instance. They advocated for government anti-poverty programs, including things like Social Security, so that the elderly would not find themselves impoverished once they were too old to work. Progressives placed strong emphasis on conservation, for instance by expanding the national park system. And progressives were some of the leading advocates of prohibition, arguing that alcohol was the root cause of a variety of social problems affecting the nation at that time. Pictured in this slide is Jane Addams, meeting with children at Hull House. Addams was a leading progressive advocate for poverty reduction and is seen as the founder of social work as a modern professional field of work. I'd like to finish up our discussion of the progressive movement by focusing in a bit more tightly on California specifically. As I mentioned, the progressive movement was a nationwide phenomenon, but it had a particularly strong impact in California. Partly that has to do with the fact that the things that gave rise to the progressive movement, things like corporate monopolies and government corruption, these were especially deep problems in California in the late 1800s and early 1900s. While the Southern Pacific Railroad had accomplished the enormous feat of connecting California by land to the rest of the country, it came at an enormous cost, as the railroad owners used their economic wealth to buy off favorable treatment in state and local government, essentially at the expense of every other interest in the state. Southern Pacific was deeply rooted in both major political parties in the state, so when a Democrat faced off against a Republican in the general election, it was a win-win proposition for Southern Pacific because both candidates had been handpicked by the railroad. And as mentioned earlier, railroad executives used their money to line the pockets of government officials to make sure they enacted policies favorable to the corporation. I've asked you to read the article Rise and Fall of a Railroad because it gives an excellent narrative history of the power of Southern Pacific Railroad at this time. The abuses of power by Southern Pacific ultimately led to a big enough backlash for serious reform to occur. Progressives came to power in California in 1910, led by Hiram Johnson's election as governor of California on an anti-corruption campaign platform. Hiram Johnson, pictured here with Teddy Roosevelt when he was Roosevelt's vice presidential running mate in the 1912 election, is a giant of California political history. The reforms that he engineered, along with his fellow progressives in the early 19-teens, utterly transformed politics and government in the state. It was during his administration as governor that California enacted the direct democracy tools of initiative, referendum, and recall. He created and staffed a railroad commission that stripped Southern Pacific of its ability to control shipping and transportation rates throughout the state. He led the push to enact workers' compensation and wage laws. He pushed through the direct primary, stripping party insiders of their power to anoint candidates as the party nominee. And he supported the successful effort for women to gain the right to vote. This is a remarkable legacy of reform, coming right on the heels of an era in which it seemed that a handful of political and economic elites had a stranglehold over the state. Since Hiram Johnson was such a pivotal figure in California's progressive movement, I couldn't resist including a second image of him here. And this picture almost perfectly captures him as the progressive ideal, the honest man ready to fight the corrupt powers that be. This sort of fighting spirit has remained an animating force in California politics for the 100 years since Johnson's time. Californians in particular have shown themselves willing and eager to use the tools of direct democracy to enact sweeping reforms. And this is a legacy that has infused itself across the political spectrum. So it's not just modern-day progressives or liberals who use direct democracy to go around government insiders and take their case directly to the people. Conservatives actively use these tools as well. So I'm thinking here of things like Proposition 13, sometimes called the Taxpayers' Revolt, that place strict limits on property taxes and the ability of elected representatives to raise taxes, or the recall of Democratic Governor Gray Davis in 2003 and his replacement with Republican Arnold Schwarzenegger. The idea here is that Californians of all stripes are particularly imbued with an activist orientation towards citizen involvement in government. And finally, a major legacy of the progressive movement is captured by the Tocqueville quote that centralization will be the natural government. Progressives, more than any other political movement, established the idea that the purpose of government is not just to protect individual liberties, but it's also to take an active role in shaping society for the common good. While some progressive ideas about the rationalization of government have fallen out of favor, their reforms, like establishing a professional civil service rather than a spoils system, have been critical in creating a government that can carry out programs in a competent way. So California's transportation system, our water network, our public university systems that are world-renowned, these are all legacies of the progressive movement, which put into action the idea of an active government that is significantly involved in charting the state's future course. Modern-day liberals and conservatives certainly have disagreements about exactly how active government should be, but few people suggest that the government should retreat to where it stood before the progressive movement, with citizens largely at the mercy of wealthy corporate powers.